Hi, good morning. So it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Andrea Schill. Andrea is the policy analyst at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, where she leads efforts to drive sustainable practice in garment and footwear supply chains. With extensive experience working across Europe and Southeast Asia, she has collaborated with a diverse range of stakeholders, from fashion brands to civil society organizations, and has played a key role in developing practice tools to support due diligence initiatives. Today, Andrea will be sharing her insights on how due diligence and social audits are evolving and why it's crucial for companies, auditors, audit firms, and meaningful stakeholders to adapt as expectations change. In her presentation, reflecting on the past, preparing for the future, due diligence and social audits, she will explore how we can strengthen our due diligence process, improve transparency, and align with emerging standards for long-term success. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Schill to the stage.
Thank you, Gabriella. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here today, and thanks to APSCA for organizing this important event and for having us here today. Today I will talk about social audits and due diligence. I will reflect on the past and maybe also on the present and provide key recommendations or considerations for companies, auditing firms and auditors to prepare for the future. So while the world around us is shifting rapidly, the challenges for workers are shifting extremely slow sometimes, even if at all. Market and legal expectations towards companies to conduct due diligence are rising, and responsible business conduct is becoming non-negotiable. Yet the size and complexity of global supply chains make it sometimes very difficult for companies to identify and address labor, environmental, and integrity risks and impacts in their supply chains, but also in their own operations. As a result, many companies turn to social audits for support, and many will continue to do so. And audits come with many benefits. They increase visibility on risks and impacts. They provide information for companies to conduct their due diligence. And with that, they might even reduce the workload for sustainability teams. And if companies work together, they can even share audit results and reduce audit fatigue and costs, and ultimately free up resources. Audits can also provide technical expertise that may not be available in the company. So that may be health and safety issues, but it may also be how to engage with workers meaningfully. So how to make workers feel comfortable to speak up freely, how to speak with them in their local language and understand their cultural backgrounds. Audits can also provide an additional layer of independent accountability, which distinguishes them clearly from self-reporting or self-assessments. So that all sounds good, but how do social audits and due diligence fit together? The due diligence approach is based on the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the ILO M&E Declaration, and the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. So all of these are government-backed instruments. Due diligence is different from the traditional audit approach that we know since the 1990s, when the first audits emerged. Due diligence is not about attesting perfection. It is about attesting the ability of a company to identify and address risks and impacts, any risks and impacts that may come their way. This means that due diligence does not attest outcomes, so outcomes like the absence of a certain risk or impact like forced labor, or outcomes like the presence of something specifically, like an emergency exit. It is about really due diligence is the means to deliver on the outcomes, to achieve these outcomes ultimately. Due diligence is about establishing the necessary management systems and setting up robust processes and credible targets. And Lucia has underlined that in her keynote yesterday when she talked about forced labor and human trafficking and the importance of responsible recruitment processes. So in practice, this means instead of checking if wages have been paid on time, due diligence is about asking the company to set up credible policies on wages, assessing the risk around wage payment. If there is a risk identified and prioritized, then also thinking about corrective actions, tracking the progress against that, publicly talking about what the company is doing, and also talking, of course, with the workforce, what the measures are. And ultimately also setting up credible grievance mechanisms. So if there is a complaint in the future, that the company can be alerted to that. Due diligence is about prevention and mitigation of risks and harm, and if necessary, of course, about remediation to those affected by harms. Due diligence is also about supporting and incentivizing suppliers to improve. But it's also about reflecting on own contributions to harm. For example, through looking at own purchasing practices or product development. Ultimately, due diligence is about prioritization. This might still be the biggest difference between social audits and due diligence as we know them today. Companies are not expected to do everything, everywhere, and all at once in due diligence standards. Due diligence standards are designed to focus attention of companies and resources on where risks and impacts are most likely and most severe. And yes, this means that a company will not work on all risks and impacts at the same time. It means making genuine efforts to improve over time. While we at the OECD see progress across auditing and certification schemes, taking up many of these expectations that I just outlined and trying to integrate them into their written standards, you might agree that not all social auditing standards do that already. So the theme that APSCA has selected for this annual meeting, Navigating the Future of Social Compliance, is very timely. Navigating a new era is not without challenges, and it's complex. So I would like to address companies, so audit firms and auditors now, and explain how they could innovate and ensure that social audits remain relevant and become an effective tool. So I first like to talk to companies. I already outlined the many benefits that audits can have to companies. And there are two recommendations that I would like to share to companies today. First, carefully evaluate the audits you intend to use. Today's landscape of audits is increasing in size and complexity. While there is willingness across audit companies to adapt and improve, significant shortcomings have also been identified. This includes quality of assessments, oversight, and potential conflicts of interest. At the OECD, we conduct alignment assessments, which means we look at written standards of initiatives, compare them with the OECD expectations. But in many cases, we also look at implementation, so we shadow audits, and we have seen those shortcomings ourselves as well. We have seen auditors asking leading questions, not taking up severe red flags that have been openly shared in conversations, or accepting insufficient evidence. So companies need to carefully evaluate the scope, assessment methodologies, auditor competencies, and ultimately also the governance of auditing firms. to get high quality information. Second recommendation is to reflect what role social audits can and cannot play in due diligence. In our work with companies, we see a lot of over-reliance of companies on audits as the only tool. And it has been shared yesterday that audits are only one tool, and they are just a snapshot in time. And companies will need to complement them with red flag systems that find and tackle problems in between audits, with effective grievance mechanisms, and with meaningful engagement with workers and other stakeholders. Companies retain the ultimate responsibility for their due diligence. They cannot outsource that to third-party audits completely. We have also seen companies, and here I might rather speak about brands, that do not reflect what audit findings may also say about themselves. A number of risks, such as delayed payments or excessive overtime at the factory, is strongly correlated with purchasing practices of brands, of buying companies. So if a company only requires suppliers to improve overtime and payment of wages, but does not reflect its own responsibility, its own relationship to the harm, then it does not use audit findings effectively. Companies should be aware of these limitations, including the credibility questions, and consider where an audit adds value, where it's needed, where it's targeted, and where it would rather be a tick box exercise. The OECD will publish a paper in February about the role of certifications in due diligence. And I invite you also to read that. And we also have a forum in February. So I invite you also to that. I would now like to talk to audit firms. As we move towards a new era, there are two recommendations that I would like to share with auditing firms in the room. First, integrate due diligence expectations in your written standards where relevant. Attesting a company's due diligence, so the ability of a company to identify and address risks and harms, is likely to be more effective in the long term than attesting that a certain outcome is present or something is absent. Harv from the ILO yesterday outlined how difficult it is to find harassment cases through audits, and that it's underreported. So this really makes the case for integrating due diligence expectations in written standards of audits, because it would require the company to set the right policies and the right processes and a grievance mechanism that harassment cases could be reported. And circumstances, you all know that, can change quickly. Audits are a snapshot. An underage worker that is not present in the factory today when the audit takes place may be recruited the next day. So how valuable is such an audit result then? Companies that are attested for having, for example, a responsible recruitment process and trained human resource officers that can detect underage workers and that can also react and respond responsibly to child labor cases, they will be more successful to react also to changing circumstances. For example, when we face an economic crisis that might draw children out of school and more towards seeking employment in factories. They will be more successful than a company that has received a check at the question whether they have a simple zero-tolerance child labor policy. Yes, audits might increase due to legislation, as Craig yesterday pointed out, but they also need to innovate. Companies will want to know more about the management systems of suppliers and whether the supplier is really able to identify and address risks and impacts. So not integrating such expectations is a missed opportunity for audit firms, but ultimately for workers, which yeah, we all claim to stand up for. Due diligence audits would also not necessarily be more resource intensive, as the time and resources will be directed differently based on the risk profile. Due diligence audits would be more targeted audits and allow spending time on offsite interviews, for example, and exploring the main issues. A quick way to auditing firms, initiatives, certification schemes to start that journey is to complete our OECD due diligence checker, which is a self-test basically, where you can test your written standards, how much due diligence expectations are already in there, and you get like a graph that shows you where you are strong and where you have gaps, and then you can decide what makes sense to integrate, what maybe doesn't make sense to integrate because it's not your focus. Second recommendation to auditing firms: increase the quality of public information. Companies are increasingly looking for more detailed reports to not only validate findings, but also to understand the assessment methodologies and assessment process behind the findings. The more open and transparent you can be about your work, the more trust you will build with companies, but also other stakeholders. And now I would like to turn to auditors. Auditors are at the center of identifying risks and impacts in companies' own operations and supply chains. However, there's little flexibility as they face limited resources and are given an audit standard by the audit company that they have to assess. So, however, the OECD sees a real role for auditors in this new era. And I have one key recommendation for you. Deepen your understanding of the 6-step due diligence framework. The OECD has developed an e-learning academy that I would like to recommend to all of you to build up your knowledge. Assessing whether a company conducts meaningful due diligence is not easy, or as easy as a tick box exercise, or as ticking a box that there is an emergency exit, but it is possible. It requires very good sector knowledge, and you all bring that to the table. As Mary and Rochelle yesterday both outlined in their interventions, you need to understand the company profile, the context, the workforce, who owns the company, before you go and assess them. This allows you to prioritize in advance on what you want to focus. It requires more flexibility in what you prioritize investigating further on the day of the audit. And you will not be able to tick all the boxes across all the risk issues, because you will not assess them all, but you will prioritize what's really needed to assess. The demand for auditors that can assess companies' due diligence has yet to increase, because audit firms have not yet integrated all expectations. But if you build your knowledge, you will be prepared for that era. The due diligence framework will be the foundation of how companies will be expected to identify and address risks and impacts, and that includes suppliers. So let us all commit to shape a future where social audits can be credible and useful tools. Let us ensure that companies evaluate audits they intend to use and reflect on the role of audits in their due diligence. Let us ensure that audit firms consider integrating due diligence expectations, provide more information, and support auditors with more flexibility. Let us ensure that auditors build up their skills and knowledge on due diligence and are supported by auditing firms to do so. But most importantly, let us move away from attesting perfection, but focus on attesting companies' ability to identify, prevent, mitigate, and remediate risks and harms that may come their way. And I want to close with what is guiding me when I am in doubt and facing a challenge. Those that do not try are sure to lose. So let us try, and maybe we win. Thank you.